Hello and welcome back to Bitesize Boxing. So today I want to talk about a potential fight that is currently being rumoured, and that fight is Anthony Joshua versus Tony Yoka. Two Olympic gold medalists going back to back and fighting each other. Now, of course, Anthony Joshua medalled in the 2012 Olympics, Yoka in the 2016 Olympics. Both of them, let's be frank, were pretty controversial in the way that they got their medals, particularly Tony Yoka. I don't think there's anybody outside of France that thought he beat Joe Joyce in that final. But that being said, we're talking about two Olympic gold medalists, so two guys with very good amateur pedigree at the very least. And so yeah, let's talk about this fight. So Anthony Joshua, coming off of that devastating knockout defeat to Daniel Dubois last year in Wembley. Now, it's an interesting one with AJ. He's actually a bit older than I thought he was. I don't know why I thought AJ was about sort of 33, 34, but he's actually 35, going on 36, I think, next year. So AJ is, I think, unanimously agreed now. We know he's on the slide. We know he's not quite the fighter that he used to be. Physically, again, he was somebody who was very much relied on his physicality and his explosiveness in his earlier days and in his earlier fights. And I think that is something that is waning at this point and at this juncture as well. Somebody who's never really had the best stamina either, and I think it's fair to say is somewhat fragile in the chin department as well. Although that being said, I would say with Anthony Joshua, I think in terms of one-punch sort of chin department, if that makes sense, is that he can take a decent shot. It's just the powers of recovery are non-existent. So for example, like someone like Tyson Fury, I don't think Fury has a fantastic chin either, but Fury recovers very quickly. If Anthony Joshua gets hurt, that's it, he's done. And so for someone like Anthony Joshua, that has plagued him throughout his career. You even look at that Dubois fight, he got hurt, I think it was in the end of the first round, and that was it. He was hurt for the rest of the fight, and he was up and down like a yo-yo for the rest of the fight. Same in the Andy Ruiz fight. He's somebody that if he gets hurt, he just can't recover. Now, Tony Yoka, on the other hand, his career hasn't exactly gone smoothly either. So Tony Yoka, 14-3, which is, if you told me that was going to be Tony Yoka's record a few years ago, I would have been shell-shocked. Me and Ade did a sit-down about, oh God, it must have been about 4, 5, 6 years ago. I think it was during the first lockdown, actually. We did it over Zoom. And me and Ade were discussing back then about who we thought in the mid-2020s would be the next dominant heavyweight coming through. And we both said Tony Yoka. We were certain this guy was going to pull up trees and do big things, but it just hasn't happened. Now, it would be remiss of me to not mention he didn't fail a drugs test, but I believe it was about 3 or 4 occasions. I think it was VADA or WADA turned up to test him and he wasn't there. And he seemingly went missing for those drug tests. So he served a ban as a result of missing those drug tests. And then post missing those drug tests, where he didn't fail a test, I just want to make that clear. I'm not saying that Tony Yoka failed a drug test, just saying. But he wasn't present for those tests. Since then, his performances have dipped, so make of that what you will. Now, I remember Dave Allen talking about when he fought Tony Yoka back in 2018, it was the hardest he'd ever been hit, and that he couldn't believe the power of Tony Yoka. In fact, I referred to this in my Arslanbek Makhmudov versus Dave Allen preview video on Monday, no, would it have been Saturday or Sunday whenever I made that, and I referred to it back then that he had basically said, Allen said that the hardest he'd ever been hit, and clearly the most hurt he'd ever been was against Yoka, which is interesting because, as I said, Yoka isn't really a puncher either, and yet he's hit him very hard seemingly, misses some drugs tests, and then he starts losing. So, he then had 3 back-to-back losses against Martin Bakole, Carlos Takam, and Riyad Murray. Now, let's sort of analyse these. Now, Martin Bakole, I don't think, given everything that's happened since then, I don't think that's necessarily a bad loss. It was definitely an upset at the time. It was a majority decision, but that is laughable. He lost that fight clearly. Yoka was hurt multiple times, and Yoka basically just went into survival mode for the majority of that fight. He was very clearly unsettled by Bakole. Bakole was imposing himself on Yoka, and Yoka didn't like it. And so, yeah, he lost that fight clearly. He only lost a majority decision, but that's more to say, really, the French judging. When we're talking about dodgy judging around the world, France is probably the worst in the world. And I mean that out of anywhere, including places like Britain. Of course, you have some places that are more fair, like Japan, but as the worst go, I don't think there's anywhere worse than France. So he clearly lost to Martin Bakole. He then lost another split decision, this time to Carlos Takam, which was a real shocker, really, because again, this was not a prime Carlos Takam. This was a very jaded Carlos Takam who must have been, what, late 30s, early 40s by this point. And yeah, this was back in 2013. So again, losing a decision to Carlos Takam straight after the loss to Bakole, a very bad look. And then he went in there as a comeback fight against, I believe he's Belgian, and that is Riyad Murray, who was a cruiserweight stepping up, and not a particularly good one at that. And he lost to Riyad Murray as well on another split decision. But again, it's France. Don't read anything into that. So that was a really, really bad loss because, again, Riyad Murray is not a good cruiserweight, let alone a heavyweight, and he's beaten Tony Yoka. Since then, Tony Yoka has rebounded with 3 wins, but again, they're at very low levels and really just journeyman that he's turning over. So with Tony Yoka, it's been a really sort of disappointing career thus far. He's not lived up to any of the promise that he showed in the amateurs and in his early pro career. I think there definitely has to be an eyebrow raised as to why that is. But again, Tony Yoka, as I say, he's just not lived up to the promise. He's not looked anywhere near as good as he looked earlier on in his career. Physically as well, it must be worth noting, he doesn't look as defined. Is that a case of issues in terms of potential? Let me pick my words carefully. He missed those tests and he's looked less defined and he's looked less good. Is that something to do with potential foul play there, or is, in the interests of fairness, he's also gone through a lot in his personal life? I believe he went through a very high-profile divorce in France, which has actually pushed his career, I think, over to the UK to move over here to get out of the spotlight. So is it a case of foul play going on behind the scenes, or is it a case of Tony Yoka has just had a lot of personal issues which has plagued his career as a result of that? In the interest of fairness, I should mention that, but it has to be said that Tony Yoka is massively underwhelmed. He's not looked good. The fit with Virgil Hunter has just not worked stylistically. He seems to have regressed, if anything, under Hunter. So again, I think there needs to be wholesale changes, and I think that's what he's trying to do. Now, a potential fight against Anthony Joshua, whilst I wouldn't make him the favourite, again, he has got the pedigree to trouble someone like Joshua just based on the fact that he is a well-schooled amateur. Anthony Joshua, on the other hand, we know what we're getting with Anthony Joshua. I think the problem with Anthony Joshua is more his mentality, his confidence, because this is a guy that, to me, has never ever looked the same. I think his confidence was shattered a little bit. I'd say it was cracked in that Vladimir Klitschko fight when he touched down for the first time, and it was shattered against Ruiz, and it's never really recovered. Going in and getting absolutely banjoed against Dubois is going to do no wonders for that confidence. When you look at the meltdown he had after fighting Usyk for the second time in the ring, he had a complete meltdown. He basically mentally just fell apart in front of the world, and it was very, very embarrassing. And in his fights after that, those little rebuild fights they were doing against the likes of Jermaine Franklin, he didn't look good at all. He looked mentally shot in those fights, and he had to kind of rebuild himself very, very slowly just to get to the Dubois fight, and then he got shattered again. So where is someone like Anthony Joshua at mentally? That's a question we have to ask. But again, we have to be fair and say Tony Yoka is somebody who doesn't look mentally the toughest either. So it is an interesting potential fight. It really is a loser leaves town fight. It's a crossroads fight. So it is an interesting fight in as much of that, because whoever loses this fight, they're done, throw them on the scrap heap. And really and truly, whoever wins this fight, they're not going to go on to world honours. It's just a case of the winner sort of moves forward somewhat and the loser is done. So it's an interesting affair. I think stylistically you'd have to favour Anthony Joshua just in as much of the fact that he has fought at a far higher level for far longer. Again, he's been a unified champion. He's been at world level now for about 10 years, whereas Tony Yoka has never even reached world level. But that being said, it really depends on how much Joshua has left. If Joshua is absolutely mentally and physically shot from that Dubois fight, then Yoka could conceivably win this fight, especially considering Anthony Joshua has been out of the ring now for a year with injuries since then. So it does seem that the excessive training that Joshua has done, because this is another thing with Anthony Joshua, for some strange reason, he does like 4-month training camps. That's why a fight will get made for Joshua and then the fight is in about 3.5, 4 months time. Whereas with most fighters, they're normally having 6 to 8 week camps. This whole career, he's been doing these crazy long camps, which is now really showing on his body. Hence why he's out. He's having to have surgeries, having extended absences. He's going to fights with niggles that he's been talking about a lot more. So the body could well be breaking down for Joshua. And if it is, again, maybe someone like Tony Yoka can capitalise on that. But I think my early feelings going into this is that Anthony Joshua should have enough to get over Tony Yoka. Tony Yoka is somebody who, he has that fragile look to him. He doesn't seem to like pressure. He doesn't like if somebody can impose himself on him. And someone like Anthony Joshua definitely has the style to do that. But again, is Anthony Joshua going to have the mentality? Is he going to have it upstairs to be able to do that? You can see a world where both men are quite tentative, and it's really whoever has enough cojones to put it on the line enough and is offensive enough to win. You can see a world in which both men, because of their recent form, are very tentative, and it's basically just the man who commits slightly more. You know, if this is the Joshua who turns up against somebody like Helenius or someone like Franklin, then you can see a world in which conceivably Yoka wins this. Yes, the Helenius fight ended in a knockout, but not until AJ got his nose busted and was looking very ropey in that fight. And on the back of such a horrible knockout that he suffered to Dubois, you can see a world in which he's very tentative. So someone like Yoka could outbox Joshua if he's too tentative. We'll have to see. But as I say, early feelings, I think AJ should have enough to win this. But again, it wouldn't surprise me if he, if this went either way. But you let me know what you think. I'd be very interested to know. It's an intriguing affair given where both fighters are at. But what say you? You let me know. I'd be very interested to know. Thank you very much. Take care. Cheers.